Hi, this time I wanted to talk about my MMORPG experience. I thought about this video after I uploaded a somewhat recent video where I talked about how you could use strategy guides for different video games as campaign setting books for tabletop role playing games. Oh, and for those that are new to the channel, because maybe someone who is more focused on video games and MMORPGs got into this channel because of the title of this video, but I'm mainly focused on tabletop role-playing games. I also talk about board games and anime and such, but it's mostly focused on tabletop role-playing games. That is this channel. So I've noticed some important differences with the MMORPG genre. And I just wanted to talk about my experience as to how I got into it, how I left it for quite some time, and in what ways at times I am still participating in that type of activity. And this video is I'm going to elaborate quite a bit on how I got started. So you may find it a bit away from the main question or point at the beginning. So I hope you will be patient, because I think that way of framing this video will give you some reasons as to why I like some of the things I like in MMORPGs or why I dislike some other things. Well, many years ago, probably in 1999, I heard about this awesome game known as EverQuest. But there were two obstacles for me to getting into EverQuest. My computer wasn't exactly the best computer. It could barely run some computer games, low graphics and such. And the other thing was that internet was quite terrible back then. You know, you had your dial-up modem with that weird sound, that static noise, you know. And you had to keep track. The internet service provider back then basically charged you by the minute. So it wasn't a monthly fee. You basically had to take to write down how many minutes or hours you were going to use internet, and you were going to be charged based on that. It was quite terrible. So I simply couldn't get into EverQuest, and I also couldn't afford the monthly fee. I was in my early teens. I didn't have too much money or an access to a credit card back then. So it was simply out of the question. So I felt really sad that I couldn't enjoy that experience where you were playing with thousands of people in that same game world. And because I was already into Dungeons and Dragons, I also found it quite exciting that you could play as a ranger, paladin, warrior, etc. So it was quite sad. But later on, well, after reading a few video game magazines, it was a magazine known as Game Something. Many magazines back then had game at the beginning, like Game Fan, Game Hobby, Game, etc. And I saw this review of a game known as Dot Hack. And something caught my attention, two things mostly. The first one, the character design, the design of the main character. I have his image right here. This is actually a set of 4 novels based on that video game. The main character is this one, dressed in orange and yellow. Next to this, this is Black Rose. This is another one of the main characters, and she is the main character of these novels because these novels are kind of like the version of the events as seen through Black Rose's eyes, that is, of the heroine's eyes. And so you have a bit of a he said, she said sort of situation. Like in video games, you see things through the eyes of the male protagonist, and in the novels, you see what happens through the eyes of Black Rose. So the character design of that main character, which is known as Skite, seemed quite interesting because he had these funky colors like orange with yellow and green. He looked a bit clownish At least to me, he looked kind of like that. But he had this very determined look on his eyes. So I started reading that review, and it turns out that it was sort of like a simulation of an MMORPG. It was a weird type of game because you played as a player that created a character in this MMORPG known as the world. So I decided to get that first volume, and I think it changed my life, at least when it comes to MMORPGs. And it created some fantasy conceptions of what they were, and I had to adjust to that dramatic change, at least within the context later on. And I really enjoyed that hack. I didn't like what they did with the series later on, but the storyline is really awesome. And here are a few spoilers, but basically, as I was saying, you play as this player who is actually a 14-year-old boy, and he gets into this massive multiplayer online role-playing game known as The World. And he got into this because his best friend, a player by the name of Orca, is one of the best players, perhaps the top two players, one of the top two players in the world. He's part of this duo known as the Descendants of Fianna with another guy named Balmung. And Orca looks kind of like somewhat of a half-naked barbarian. And Valmung looks a bit like sort of like a Germanic warrior, but with angel wings. The game itself, The World, has a lot of Germanic and Celtic mythological elements. So Kite goes into the world, that is the 14-year-old boy, the protagonist, goes into the world with this character known as Kite. And that character starts out really plain looking, those orangey colors. He doesn't attain them until later on because it has to do with the supernatural aspect of the world. His character is actually like dressed in dark greens, very somewhat plain looking. And he goes with his friend Orca, who has been playing the world for about a year or two. So he's really powerful. He has leveled up his character so much to the point that, well, Kite is level 1, and Orca, I don't remember if he's level 50. I'm not exactly sure. But, well, they go into this dungeon that is supposed to be a dungeon for newbies, a very low level dungeon. So Orca is completely confident that his friend, the protagonist, Kite, is able to take on any challenge that happens or appears in that dungeon. So they start fighting some really weak enemies, Kite killing them because Orca, well, he's too overpowered, it wouldn't be fun. But then they bump into this terrifying entity known as Scathe. It's part of the plotline of the game. And I know this doesn't have much to do with MMORPGs, but I really want to talk about this plotline because it's really cool. And Skate, basically, it's too powerful of an enemy. He shouldn't be in that particular dungeon. That's a dungeon for low level enemies. So Orca gets really scared. He knows that something's out of place, and he starts fighting against this enemy, but all of his attacks, they just miss and miss and miss. It looks really scary. It seems out of place, and suddenly this creature does this weird attack on Orca. It's basically a data drain, and he eliminates Orca before Kite's very eyes. It's also important to note that a mysterious white girl gave Orca this book of runes, and they don't know exactly what this book is all about. And Kite just barely escapes because he gets rescued by a hacker known as Helva. But the truly scary thing is that in real life, the player that played as Orca is now in a coma, as if the attack that he suffered in the game actually affected him in real life. So all of those anime and video games, or at least most of those that have something to do with games affecting the character outside, that they fall into a coma or they get trapped inside the video game, etc., they usually took inspiration from .hack. If I'm not mistaken, I think .hack was the first one to make such an event popular, that is getting trapped inside the game world, at least in games and anime and manga. If you know of another example before dot hack, please let me know in the comment section below, because I'm really curious about that. So I started to get a really exciting feeling about MMORPGs through that game, not only because of the plotline, but because when you played as Kite, as a 14-year-old boy, you kind of played inside the world, and outside, that is, you felt as if you were a kid using a computer, and you got emails and you could watch the news, so you felt like you were using the computer inside of a computer. It was somewhat of a weird, almost in a fourth wall, breaking the fourth wall type of way. Not so much, but it felt like that. The whole game is awesome if you want to play like an old PlayStation 2 game that has a really cool storyline. I recommend that one. And later on, with, as I was telling you, the heroine Black Rose, later on she locks into the world, and she's actually quite a newbie in video games in general, but she tries to act like really bossy and sometimes pushy and intense, but she doesn't know how to play well, at least at the beginning. She's there because her kid brother also got trapped into the world. So she's with Kite, they're kind of like the duo or the main team that is trying to figure out things, and they make such a great team together because Kite, for a 14-year-old boy, he's almost like an archetype of maturity. He's just so calm and collected, but sometimes he hesitates and has some doubts. But in contrast, Black Rose, even though she's too hot-headed, she's always acting and saying things before thinking of what the consequences will be. She also kind of like pushes Kite forward when he gets stuck, while he, let's say, moderates her fire a bit. So they make a really awesome team. And as I played the world, that is dot hack, I started to get this fantasy idea that MMORPGs were going to be incredibly fantastic, because you always had like met a lot of incredible people in the world, in the game world, that is. They all seemed really eager to help, and they seemed really friendly. So they created sort of like a fantasy concept of what an MMORPG should be, but it's not like that actually. And so it got you really excited of actually trying the real thing. You want to see, talk with different people and go questing together and communicate with them. Suddenly you didn't notice, and you were playing with this guy who was there's actually an anime where one of the characters, if I'm not mistaken, is kind of like the CEO of a company, and then you play with this other player that is like a pregnant mom, and then you play, so you kind of get a sense that there are a lot of people playing MMORPGs. So after moving from dot hack, I got really happy because I found out that Final Fantasy XI was going to come out for the PlayStation 2. So I was, because I had a somewhat crappy computer, I got really excited about that. So I immediately, when it came out here in Mexico, I went to a gaming convention, Mexico City, and after getting, I won't say in line, but you have to basically swim through all of those people trying to get their own copy. I managed to get my hard drive, because you had to purchase the game with a hard drive that you connected to the PlayStation 2 to play the game. And I started to play Final Fantasy XI, and all of the fantasy ideas that the world that dot hack placed into me were completely shattered. It was not like dot hack at all. In Final Fantasy XI, I was really amazed at how most of the game world was just one huge world, although at times you did see some divisions, that is, it felt like you were moving from one instance to the other, but most of the time you felt like this huge world. So I started to get to know how to move around the world, and that is in Final Fantasy XI, Vanadil, and it was so amazing. Everything felt so big. It feels very different from, for example, World of Warcraft, even though in the long-term side of things, I think I got more of a positive experience with World of Warcraft rather than Final Fantasy XI, in a sense, just in a sense. And in World of Warcraft, you know how your character, you look at it from too far away, and that takes a bit of the immersiveness from the experience. In my opinion, in Final Fantasy XI, the camera is a bit closer to your character, so when you look around at the world, you feel like you are actually there. It feels a bit more immersive. So I was fascinated by this concept. However, I found out that it was the community was not exactly as in that hack, of course. Um, Even though I wouldn't call it a bad community, sometimes um, because of the different lifestyles, perhaps, and schedules, it wasn't too easy to find groups. That game required a lot of grinding. It was very slow to level up. You needed to go to a certain dangerous area, and you had to either create your own group or looking for a group, looking for someone with a spot available in their party. And that took quite a bit of time. It depends, but sometimes you felt like you spent more time looking for a group than actually playing the game. So that was a somewhat difficult concept to grasp. It was unlike in that hack, you basically just need to contact the party member. Oh, we are there. So it was somewhat difficult. And when you actually got to know some people, you call them your online friends. Sometimes life got in the way, or some different type of playing style. Because one time we actually have a full group of 6 people, but then, for example, a member of the group had to quit because life matters got in the way. A couple of them got really, and this is somewhat frequent at times in MMORPGs. They got a bit too much into the game, to the point that they were juggling many characters at the same time, and you notice that these people simply wouldn't stop playing. That is, let's say that you played at a certain time in the day, perhaps for a couple of hours, and you logged out and you went back at night, and they were still on, and they were already many levels above. And it really seemed like a bit like a vice or an addiction, because sometimes the group came to an agreement together. They said like, let's level up tomorrow, or nobody makes it past level 15, or well, probably a bit higher than that, so that we can grow up in levels as a group. And they ignored that completely, and suddenly the next day that those couple of people were already in their level 30s or something, and you're like, wow, what did you do? Did you spend all night playing? And what about our agreement that we should level up together? And they're like, oh no, well, we got a bit too excited. And so there were some problems, and it wasn't that easy to, if that happened, if your group started to separate, you needed to look for new members, and again you're kind of like looking for a group, and if you see if their playing style matched with yours. So it was too much spending time doing those things that didn't feel too exciting, in my opinion. And it was also funny that because all of the characters are comparatively weak to the enemies, that is, this is not a game where you can take on a lot of enemies during mid levels. You usually gang up 6 people against a single opponent. And I remember one time I had guests at my house, and I was playing and it's kind of like the beach area. I forget the name of the area, but my group and I, we were fighting against this small crab that is actually a very powerful crab. A single crab of this one, if you are the same level of that crab, you won't be able to solo that enemy. You really need a group, and we were killing those crabs one at a time. And one of my guests passed by, and she saw that crab, and she said, "What are you doing to that poor little crab?" So at times, many times, Final Fantasy XI didn't make you feel too heroic, because you were fighting smaller things than yourself. Especially if you, for example, if you played as an Elvan or a Galka, you were just these huge guys attacking like a rabbit or something. So it was really funny. It kind of looked like you were like 6 thugs beating on some poor animal or something, and that took a bit away from the experience. Later on, there are some more powerful enemies, even huge enemies, but as you level up, you need to grind those smaller enemies, and it doesn't feel really heroic, in my opinion. So it was somewhat difficult, as I was saying, to keep a group together. But there was a lot of magic in Final Fantasy XI. That is, the you became fascinated with the game world, the graphics. But for that time, I would consider them beautiful. That is, they are not the best looking graphics, but they had a lot of details. And you liked how it felt like a real world. Suddenly you were at this beach that I was telling you, and when it came nighttime, there were these undead enemies appearing out of nowhere, and they were quite deadly. I really enjoyed the sense of danger in Final Fantasy XI. And there were some areas that you simply could not get by without some higher level escorting you. And there were a lot of times, if you wanted good experience, or if you wanted to go to Juno and get some things that you could only get there, that is a major city of the game, you needed to run and sneak your way through some of the most dangerous areas. So it was really exciting waiting for that enemy to move by, so you could quickly run and hope that an enemy wouldn't spawn next to you. There were a lot of exciting moments related to that danger. Sometimes there were some really good leveling areas. And I remember one time that I ended up in, it was somewhat like a jungle, a Jutunga jungle if I'm not mistaken. And I went with my group, but we got into a really nasty situation. A couple of enemies attacked us at the same time, and I was the only survivor of my entire group. And I was like, oh no, what do? I don't want to die, because in that game, some people compare it a bit to Dark Souls, and that is in the sense that if you die in Final Fantasy XI, you suffer a severe experience penalty. So you're talking about losing hours that you have invested on your character if you die. And so I was like, oh no, I was messaging one of my friends, I need to get out of this jungle. And he was like, oh, don't worry, let me see if I can guide you. And he's trying like using a map from strategy guide, trying to guide me. But oh no, that area is not mapped. And I'm, what? And we couldn't like find my exact location. I actually had to wait for a higher level that was passing by, that he suddenly spotted me, and he took me halfway back out of the jungle, and he, because he could easily defeat the enemies there, and he told me, no, well, just keep going forward and take a quick right immediately the first turn that you see, and you'll make it out and such. And so I managed to get out of that alive. It was really an intense or jarring experience. I didn't want to my character to die and lose all of those experience points. So it was a really magical experience, and I will talk a bit more about some of the things that I like it later on in this video. But I'm going to switch now from Final Fantasy XI to World of Warcraft. Because of the group issues that I was talking about, that sometimes the group didn't wasn't too stable, and if you wanted to create like a link shell, kind of like a guild of players, you needed to invest quite a bit of time into that. You needed to promote. First of all, the link shell was quite expensive, if I'm not mistaken. You needed to promote that link shell, go through different cities and say, hey, do you want to join this link shell, or are we going to this type of activities, and we camp in this area. And so it was somewhat of a hassle, of slightly annoying to do. But that sense of discovering the best areas to camp, that is, and to pull different enemies towards your group so that they could finish them off and gain experience was so exciting, because back then you didn't have too much information about the game world, so it was almost by word of mouth that you got to know where the best areas were. That, oh, the secret beach in this place, I don't remember the name of the area, but there was this secret, like a small beach that you had to go through a little tunnel to get to it, and not all of the players knew about it, just a few groups. So it was a great place to get some really powerful enemies to fight you and gain some experience. Later on, it was not a secret beach anymore. Remember, this is the beginning of Final Fantasy XI. That's why some things were not yet too discovered or popular. So I actually decided to quit the game later on. I just told the remaining couple of members in the group that you know what, I can't do this anymore because life is getting too busy, and every time we're just spending too much time looking for a group. And then I found out that there was this powerful set of the artifact armor, if I'm not mistaken, that you actually needed a lot of people to get it, like a raid in World of Warcraft, and we had trouble getting a single group, so imagine getting even more people than that. So I said I am going to have to quit this, because Final Fantasy XI had a monthly subscription. And later on you realize that many things in the game are made, let's say, clumsy or slow, I would say, so that you spend more time playing. Because if you were to fulfill your objectives somewhat quickly, you would probably, some people would probably stop playing because they will feel, oh well, I reached my highest level, now I feel like fulfilled, and now I'm going to quit the game. And because Square Enix charged you a monthly fee for playing Final Fantasy XI, well, it was in their interests to make your character move really slow. I remember all of those times that I was moving through Sandoria with the song that and you suddenly it became somewhat too tedious to move from one place to the other. Your character was so slow, and renting a chocobo was somewhat, well, not exactly expensive, but you had to pay something in-game currency that is not real money. And the chocobo was still somewhat slow for me, and it was very difficult to get from one city to the other. Sometimes you had to take a boat. I don't remember how much time you had to make it, so it felt like real time. So there were many things in game that felt like they took too much time, too much trouble. You also have to invest some time in crafting different things, using different crystals to create weapons or whatever you dedicate your character to create. But it's the funny thing, those things that you hated from the game, you also love the game because of that. Because once you actually crafted something really good, or when you actually managed to get your group going, or when you managed to get from one city to a city that felt that it was at the other side of the world, it felt like it was such an accomplishment because of that. But because I was really busy in real life, and we simply could not keep like a cohesive group together, I decided to quit Final Fantasy XI. Later on, I experimented with some other online role-playing games, like for example Monster Hunter and such, but it didn't feel the same. It was divided basically by lobbies, and then it was like an instance sort of thing. You didn't feel like this huge game world. It was like a lobby, and you met other people, and you were like, oh, let's hunt this monster or whatever. And when you went into that particular instance, you got the monster, rinse and repeat. I know it's a very let's say not a fair way to put it, or to somewhat simplify things a bit too much, but after doing it dozens and dozens and dozens of times, it felt repetitive to me. But then I found out about World of Warcraft, and I started playing World of Warcraft, and from a gameplay perspective, and from a perspective that you actually feel like you get your money's worth, I actually enjoyed World of Warcraft a lot more than Final Fantasy XI. That is, I'm talking about vanilla World of Warcraft. That is the beginning with no expansions. In there, it was so easy to actually feel that you were leveling up. You had all these quests and objectives that you could tackle them on your own or with a small group. And when you actually got some groups going and raids, it was also really easy to get a group in World of Warcraft. Surprisingly easy when compared to Final Fantasy. A lot of people, I don't know how it is right now, but some people said that the community in World of Warcraft was quite toxic, but back then it wasn't like that. In fact, in my old MMORPG experience, I never noticed like there were at times a couple of sociopaths or jerks, but it was quite easy to avoid those situations. You simply stop playing with those people, or if they got a bit too annoying. For example, there was this there were two people in a group at one time, a man and a woman, and each one of them kind of like got a stalker after them, and because it was somewhat annoying because we were fighting in a certain area and they always had like this character tagging along, like they put this auto follow feature on them, and they actually had to contact game masters to ask that they be put in their place or get a warning or whatever it is that they decided to do. So in World of Warcraft, I felt it was a lot easier to get into things, but at the same time, the social aspect, I think it suffered a bit from it, not because of a toxic community, but because there wasn't too much of an interest in people of getting to know each other or socialize or whatever. Yeah, because it was also action driven. That, oh, we're going to do this raid. Are you all ready? And you have all of these different powers and abilities and spells. So you were more focused on playing the game rather than just chatting all the time. Maybe that changed later on. And that's one of the positive aspects of Final Fantasy XI, because combats were not as complex as other MMORPGs. For example, if you played as, let's say, like a monk fighter, you basically need to deal damage and provoke your enemy so that the enemy is focused on you and doesn't attack the weaker party members. It wasn't as complex, but with World of Warcraft you have so many powers and abilities and so many ways to customize your character. You had your skill trees, of course, and there were many ways in which you could play the game, and you really have to pay attention as to what is needed. Maybe the healer is in danger, and if you're a paladin, you cast this blessing to protect the healer, or the rogue always needs to know when to use his special attacks and abilities, etc. So you're always really aware of the situation and very engaged in gameplay. But it's many MMORPGs are designed with that type of simple combat, so that you can enjoy the social aspect. That is, you could be fighting enemies and still have a bit of time to talk with your party mates or party members. So it's a very different experience when I made the jump from Final Fantasy XI to World of Warcraft. But I also decided to quit World of Warcraft because I found the end game again somewhat repetitive. It was always like going to the same dungeons and the same raids, raiding this or that area to see if they managed to drop, that is, the enemy managed to drop this valuable piece of equipment or weapon. You always had to repeat the same action so many times, and it was not a sure or a given thing. There is just a small percentage of a chance that you go into that dungeon and maybe the thing that you're looking for is going to drop from that enemy. So sometimes it felt like a waste of time. I was like going 10 times into that area and the thing never dropped. So I also quit World of Warcraft. So I spent many years without playing MMORPGs. At the time, I am playing one, but I will tell you why, and it's not exactly as those other games. And at times, as different people talk about how MMORPGs are not the same anymore, are not magical, they are not like in the good old days and such, it's because there are many things. But if you were to ask me as to why some of the magic has been lost in MMORPGs, it's because, well, we're never going to go back to that golden age, in my opinion, of MMORPGs, because back then it was such a new thing, such a fresh thing. You saw this and you were like, whoa, what is that? And how do you play that? I need to play it at least once. So I think that when it comes to EverQuest and Final Fantasy XI, etc., some other games, Ultima Online you could say, but I never got into it, never played it. A lot of people, many people, went into those games just to get a taste of them. So a lot of them stayed because of that. So there was a lot of enthusiasm of people they wanted to know what this MMORPG experience was all about. And nowadays it's quite common. It's not that big of a deal. Many people take a look at the next MMORPG and they are like, oh, been there, done that. So that part of the magic is lost. Another thing is that nowadays there is just so much information about different enemies, areas, quests, that everything feels so, at times, so unexciting. Because in I never played EverQuest either, but what I've heard and read from EverQuest, many times people had to cooperate to find out exactly where this enemy was hiding, how to make their way through this labyrinth. And with Final Fantasy XI, you had to understand what things worked in the game, which classes or jobs weren't really as effective as others, how to make it through a certain area, where was you were always looking to find the best camping spot to grind, to kill off those enemies and keep the experience going, and all of that created some sort of magic, like that you were exploring this unknown world. I don't know how you would replicate that in modern MMORPGs, maybe through random dungeons perhaps, who knows. Another MMORPG that I played, I enjoyed briefly because I didn't like that they had so many glitches and broken quests, was Dungeons and Dragons Stormreach, Dungeons and Dragons Online back then. It had some pretty cool dungeons actually. When compared to Final Fantasy XI and World of Warcraft, which is basically like a huge battle game or gauntlet that is, it's always fighting. In Dungeons and Dragons Stormreach, you actually did have some traps. I remember we were 3 players. I was a ranger, a warrior, and I was a paladin, and we were got into this dungeon, and there was this treasure chest just standing there in a very narrow hallway. It was sort of like a passageway, and I remember that the warrior said like, "Oh, that place is definitely trapped. How are we going to get that chest?" And we're like, "We don't have a thief or whatever." And so the ranger, I was the paladin, and I wasn't really good at doing that. Maybe I could take quite a bit of damage, but I needed my hit points to take some damage from the enemies. And so the ranger was like, "I'm going to try something." So he basically got close to the chest, and he opened it. At the moment he opened the chest, he kind of like backflipped, and this flame just sprouted out of the walls and started burning everything, and he saved himself from perhaps dying, and that was a really awesome moment. And so I think that's another thing that I find disappointing at times of MMORPGs. A lot of them just feel like a huge gauntlet, like it's all fighting. Maybe there's a trap and fighting, and you don't feel like there is a sense of exploration. And maybe that's one of the reasons why some of the classes or jobs are sometimes unbalanced. They feel that they are not as effective as other jobs, because jobs that are completely focused on an aspect of fighting are going to feel a bit more useful than, say, a thief that is more specialized in obtaining money. In many different MMORPGs, thieves are specialized in getting some rare things, but in fighting, sometimes they are outperformed. There are some exceptions, of course. If I'm not mistaken, World of Warcraft, they actually don't have like the typical thief. It feels more like an assassin because he's focused on dealing a lot of damage. So I think that's another thing that I didn't like of MMORPGs in general, that it's all about fighting. And I enjoy fights, but video game fights are really exciting. But I think it would be also a lot better if they create classes that actually had to interact, or they had an easier time interacting with the different dungeons. That's another problem of MMORPGs when it comes to making a group. Sometimes you definitely need a healer. So, for example, in Final Fantasy XI, they wouldn't go into a group with you unless your group had a healer, or if you were a healer and the group already had one, they were like, "Oh, we don't need you." So it felt a bit like too limiting. I think there are some MMORPGs nowadays, I haven't played all of them of course, that have solved that problem, that they basically have no healing class whatsoever, or they have a healing class that's good at also other things. So I can see why some people say that the MMORPG magic has been lost a bit. But in some ways, it may have... Well, yeah, the magic is lost, but there have been some improvements in my opinion. There are some MMORPGs that are free to play. That is, they do not charge you a monthly fee, and many of them you don't even need to purchase that game. You download it and you play it, and because of advertisement or because they also have like real money shops in the game. You can basically play the game free as much as you like, and only if you want like there's some sort of package or really cool weapon that actually costs money in real life, you can get that, but you're never forced to do it. You could play the entire game using just your free gear, and you could do quite well. Because for example right now, and this may come as no surprise to many of you, I'm playing a Record of Lodoss War Online. It's a free-to-play South Korean game. If you haven't seen my review of Record of Lodoss War, I recommend that you do so. I'm going to put the link in the description below. Although it does contain a bit of spoilers when it comes to the character backgrounds. So, for example, in Record of Lodoss War Online, I'm also going to put the link in the description below so you can visit the website if you want to play that game. You don't pay a monthly fee, so you do not feel like you're not getting enough bang for your buck. You can play the game however you like, take as much time as you need to, with the right equipment. And this is not purchasing anything, that is just using your equipment that you find the game and such. You can even solo a lot of the dungeons instead of like finding a lot of people. Although I have played with groups when it comes to dungeons, and there is a noticeable difference that there is less risk and the dungeon progresses quickly when you play in a group. But if you, let's say that you decide to just play for a half hour or an hour, you could do that and still feel like you accomplished something, that you do not need to spend half an hour searching for a group. So I think that's a bit of an advantage. But yes, the MMORPG magic is somewhat lost because there are so many MMORPGs nowadays, and back then, because there were only like 2 or 3 MMORPGs that were really good, well, there were a lot of people like funneling or moving towards those different MMORPGs. But nowadays the community is just scattered. There are just so many options of MMORPGs, so sometimes the communities are divided, because there is there is a better chance of you finding the right people or the right group if there is a lot of people going to a single MMORPG. In contrast, when there are just playing so many different games, it's going to be very difficult to find the right people for you. I have seen some other MMORPG players complaining that many games, and they usually blame World of Warcraft. In a sense, I guess they are right, in that they say that MMORPGs nowadays, they feel like solo experiences. You pretty much tackle everything solo, and when you reach a certain level, and then you go into a group, and it almost feels like as of a necessity, which is such a huge contrast when you compare it to Final Fantasy XI at its best moments, that you always needed someone. There was a lot of teamwork and a really strong sense of community. When it worked that way. In my case, it didn't work too much in my favor because of the things that I mentioned. But those that actually got into that positive side of the community, it was magical for them. And for example, you do make some nice online friendships. I've lost contact with some of them, but up to this very day, there are 3 people that sometimes we just shoot ourselves an email that, oh, how have you been doing? Happy birthday or whatever. And you get to know how they have been doing in their lives. And I from other stories, I actually heard of people that I formed stronger bonds in those communities. But as I was saying, nowadays, because MMORPGs are so focused on the solo aspect, those social links or bonds are somewhat lost. I have heard that a new MMORPG is coming known as Pantheon Rise of the Fallen, if I'm not mistaken, and supposedly by one of the creators of EverQuest, or the father of EverQuest perhaps, and it's supposedly going to push that element forward, that you need a group to accomplish different things, as opposed to World of Warcraft, where you can solo most of the game. If I'm not mistaken, in Final Fantasy XIV you can also solo most of the content. So let's see if Pantheon brings back that social aspect of role-playing games. I don't know how they are going to do that, especially nowadays. People are always so busy, so you kind of understand why many MMORPGs have gone the solo route. That way, many people can enjoy the game even if they don't find a group immediately. There are also dungeons and instances. They have like an auto match feature that they make you play with other players at random. Although in the case of Final Fantasy XIV, last time I checked, they actually put you to play with people's different servers, so it makes it a bit pointless because you're not going to establish a connection with any of those people. So let's see if Pantheon rises to the challenge. It's also discouraging at times of saying that you have this monthly fee, and sometimes you do not feel like you're getting what you're paying for. So I think that free-to-play MMORPGs are going to have a bit of an advantage in that aspect. You could play the game and, oh, there's no one online, well, I'm not going to play, and you still don't feel like you're not taking advantage of that monthly fee. So yes, that has been my MMORPG experience so far. So you consider that I'm currently not as active, of course, but when I feel like the itch to get into a game and socialize through it, well, I play Record of Lodoss War Online. The combat is also quite simple. There is a satisfying amount of customization and some tactics and strategies, but because the combat is simple, when it comes to outside of dungeons, you can hunt this monster or whatever and still chat away with people, and you feel like it's somewhat of a half game, half lobby type of thing, or sorry, like half chat room, half game. And it's still quite easy to take on those dungeons, that even though you do not have a group. So because you do not get charged a monthly fee, I consider it a good game for those that are quite busy. Although the translation is terrible, it has been translated from Korean to English. Some of the characters, they sound like they have mental problems, in that there's the English that they speak there, it's not properly structured. And there are some annoying quests that I need you to fetch me this thing, this book or this item, and you have to run back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and it's not as exciting. That's something that always annoyed me in MMORPGs. If you're like a really powerful warrior or wizard or whatever, why are you doing all of those UPS FedEx type of quests, moving around from one place to the other, when you should be exploring dangerous areas and fighting dangerous creatures? Somewhat nonsensical. Well, thanks for watching this video where I talk about my experiences with the MMORPGs. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. See you later.